You're live. Welcome, students. We are going to look at more terms that you'll see on your final, possibly see on your final, which is Thursday. And I missed yesterday, but I'm going to go through some more today. The last thing we discussed was the pathway of sound through portions of the ear. Now, the next term, organs of corti. The organs of corti, remember, are those structures in the cochlea portion of the inner ear. And the organs of corti contain the cilia that move in response to endolymph passing over those cilia with the vibrations of the tympanic membrane. When that occurs in the organs of corti, those cilia move, and that nerve which picks up on the movement of those cilia, the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve sends the message to the brain. Those were the organs of corti. The crista ampullaris, which is the next term on your list, refers to structures that look very similar to the organs of corti, except they're in the vestibule and the semicircular canals. And movement of the head to the right, to the left, up, down, turning around, moves the endolymph against the hairs or cilia of the crista ampullaris, and the message is then sent to the brain as far as maintaining maintenance of equilibrium. The layers of the skin, the layers of the epidermis, melanocytes, pseudophorus glands, I'll mention that one next. These terms, layers of the skin, layers of the epidermis, melanocytes, that's self-study. I want you to study that. I don't want to feed that to you. I want to see if you know that. So study lectures 1 and 2 in dermatology following neurology. The pseudophorus glands, those were glands inside the lining of the ear that release perspiration into that ear, and that perspiration is salty, and it contains, it's salty, and that salt is a natural bactericide because it can cause bacteria and other organisms to lose fluid. They desiccate or dry up, and that's the beauty of the salt in the perspiration. And I am going to fix the good. It gets so hot so quickly in here, so thank you for your pardon me doing that. All right, autonomic, remember that is a subdivision of the peripheral nervous system. The autonomic nerves in your body send messages to smooth muscles and glands to secrete, and smooth muscles to contract. The autonomic nervous system controls heartbeat, digestion, helps with elimination, all of those things that you don't have to think about. That's autonomic, and they were divided into the parasympathetic and sympathetic. The opposite of autonomic would have been somatic. Somatic nerves are those nerves you can control, which innervate the striated muscles of the body. Neuroglia. Now, we talked about nerve cells. That was the first thing we talked about in studying the nervous system. The nervous system is made up of nerve cells, and those nerve cells have two major divisions. One is neuroglia and the other one neurons. Now, neurons are cells that can transmit an impulse from the dendrite to the cell body to the axons and collateral branches. These are neurons that not only send an impulse, to muscles, those are motor neurons. They can receive an impulse. These are sensory neurons. Your rods and cones in your eyes are sensory. The touch sensory neurons in your skin are sensory afferent neurons. They behave also with that sodium-potassium pump, sending an impulse. So those are neurons. We talked about sensory, associative neurons, and motor neurons. send an impulse. And that impulse, sending that impulse is called an action potential. That bothered me the first time I heard action potential, because action means action, potential means the potential for action. So I thought it was strange that they actually said that the transmission of the impulse from the dendrites to the cell body to the axons with that sodium potassium pump is an action potential. Why couldn't it be an action? But they didn't. It's called an action potential. When the impulse is being sent, that is an action potential. Word synapse. Synapse is a general term, and it refers to the space in between one neuron and another. If it's a space between one neuron to another, the impulse goes down the collateral branch to these in-brush button plates in the neuron, which secrete neurotransmitters that stimulate the dendrites of another neuron, and the impulse goes on. That's a synapse. It's the space between two neurons, if you're very technical. Neuro junction. I like it when they say that, because when you hear neuromuscular junction, you automatically know it's the relationship between a motor neuron and a skeletal muscle or a smooth muscle. You know that, neuromuscular or myoneural. When they say synapse, if you're actually talking about the definition, then you know it's the space between two neurons. Okay, so that's the junction. Epinephrine. Well, colloquial jargon for that is adrenaline. Epinephrine or adrenaline is secreted in the sympathetic response, and it's secreted by the medulla of your adrenal glands, and it's also stimulated or released by neurons throughout the body in the sympathetic response. It is epinephrine that's released faster, more than 72 strokes a minute, increases your blood pressure. Epinephrine also slows down the GI tract, slows down elimination. That's, when you think about that, when people are under a great deal of stress, and their sympathetic stimulated a great deal, then all of that's happening. Their digestion can be a problem. It was the first neurotransmitter that I had ever mentioned to you. And acetylcholine is the most common. It is the common neurotransmitter released by motor neurons, or sensory neurons stimulating other sensory neurons, or motor neurons, which are stimulating a striated muscle to contract. Occurs, for example, when a motor, you can see this, when a motor neuron stimulates a muscle to contract. That motor neuron releases the acetylcholine, and there's a receptor site on the striated or smooth muscle. That receptor site receives the acetylcholine and begins the contraction. Now, once it has begun the contraction, it doesn't need that motor neuron to stimulate it anymore at that point. ASE is an enzyme. Remember, a suffix with ASE. It is a stop. I've already gotten the message. That's what it does. It's which is secreted by the gland or by the muscles to stop the transmission of the impulse in the assist. And tracks are a connective tissue. You may have thousands of the axon neuron or a sensory neuron bundled together. Those axons are bundled together, and that comprises a nerve. If you look at a single surgery, you can see these nerves. Many of them are white because they're heavily myelinated by the neuroglia wrapped around them. So that is what they're referring to. It's just a tract in this, and a back a little bit, because I did miss these. I mentioned to you nerve cell. First was the impulse. The second nerve cell is a neuroglia. And as a neuron that has neuroglia wrapped around the axons, we say it is myelinated. The neuroglia does not transmit an impulse. Only the motor and sensory and associative neurons do. The neuroglia insulates, supports, protects, feeds, and at sometimes can actually kill the motor neuron or a sensory neuron. And those are referred to as satellite cells. So the satellite cells, satellite neuroglia, and the Schwann neuroglia are both in the peripheral nervous system. Those are the only two types of neuroglia in the peripheral nervous system. Now, in the central nervous system, we talked about quite a few more, and I mentioned that in your list of structures. Microglia is a neuroglia cell in the central nervous system, and so is the oligodendrocytes, which is also listed. I'm going to have you refer to page 369 in your textbook. And I will look at my glasses because I can't see jack without them, especially if they're dirty. All right. If you look on page 369, figure 10.8, you can see clearly illustrated, and it's one of my favorite pictures, the neuroglia cells. I know, my favorite pictures, I need to get alive. The neuroglia cells in the brain and the spinal cord. And the first one I want you to find that is the oligodendrocyte. Looks very different from a Schwann cell. You see in the oligodendrocyte, oh, I don't know if you can see this here, but this is the oligodendrocyte that the artist has done in yellow. And you see the nucleus in the cell body, and here you see two arms coming off that oligodendrocyte that wraps around the axon of another neuron, and the other arm wraps around the axon of another related neuron. So below that, you see another oligodendrocyte. They look very different than Schwann cells. They wrap their arms around the axons of these neurons in the brain and spinal cord and do what they're supposed to: nourish, protect, and defend. Those are oligodendrocytes. Now, right next to the oligodendrocyte is a microglial cell. And the microglial cells are neuroglia that have the ability to move. They use adenosine triphosphate, ATP, break that phosphate down in that process of maintaining the ability to move. And the microglia can actually migrate throughout brain tissue and the spinal cord and can phagocytize debris or bacteria or anything that may cause an infection or a problem. They can actually phagocytize and eat it, just like a white blood cell in your body can eat bacteria, viruses, protozoans. That's a microglia. We mentioned 4 of them. I do want to mention the other ones. If you look at an astrocyte, the astrocyte, which is right next to the microglia, that astrocyte is important because it helps maintain the blood-brain barrier. And you notice that the arms of the astrocyte actually wrap around the capillaries in the brain, and they keep some substances, some amino acids and other enzymes from actually entering the space between the neurons in the brain, because there are some substances in the bloodstream that doesn't hurt your body whatsoever, as far as the blood capillaries going through all your other tissues. But there are some things in those capillaries that can actually harm or injure these delicate neurons in the brain. So that is an astrocyte. And the other one was an epidermal cell. You'll see that up in the left-hand corner of that page from your perspective. And the epidermal cells, we had talked about those. Remember, they're the ones that are in the choroid plexus of the pia mater, and they extract from the cerebral spinal fluid the contents. They extract from the plasma the contents of the cerebral spinal fluid, and they secrete it into all those tissues around the brain cells and the spinal cells. they're responsible for that. So the ependymal cells, the microglia, the oligodendrocytes, and the astrocytes, those are 4 of the neuroglia that we find in the CNS. None of them are found in the PNS. Schwann cells and satellite cells are in the PNS, but these neuroglia are in the CNS. So that does take care of that. There's microglia. An effector. Well, we studied this early. An effector, we talked about effectors and receptors. We know that receptors are sensory neurons in the skin or in the eye, such as the photoreceptors, the rods and cones, in the ear, which are sound perceptors, auditory perceptors that we find in the organs of corti, the cilia. These are receptors. The ears, they're a receptor organ. They receive a stimuli, be it sound or vision or touch or pain. These are receptor organs containing afferent receptor neurons, sensory neurons that will go to the spinal cord and to the brain, giving a message. When the brain makes a decision, it can be autonomic or somatic, and that decision comes from the brain, down through the brain stem, down through the spinal cord, and out motor neurons. And the motor neurons take the message. They're effector motor neurons, and they take the message to smooth muscle, striated muscle, or glands, causing those motor neurons to cause the glands to secrete substances. The motor neurons and the glands are effectors. And the striated muscle in your body, the smooth muscle, you have over 600 muscles in your body. All of them are effectors. And all your glands are effectors. They're affected upon by motor neurons to contract or to secrete. So that is effectors and receptors. Now, diagram of the nervous system, all of you can do that. We've done that so many times. The nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and into the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is divided into the somatics and the autonomics. And the autonomics are divided into the parasympathetics and the sympathetics. So all of you have that breakdown. So that's what I'm asking for, is that a good solid knowledge of that diagram of the nervous system. The diencephalon. The diencephalon is, by some anatomists, they consider the diencephalon, which is the thalamus and the hypothalamus, the infundibulum, the posterior pituitary. They consider that all a part of the brainstem. So the thalamus, the diencephalon, the thalamus, the hypothalamus is considered the diencephalon along with the infundibulum. That is the diencephalon, which they link up with the midbrain pons, medulla oblongata, which is the brainstem. They put it all together. Other anatomists say no, they separate. The diencephalon is separate. And I just want you to know that there are 2 camps of thought about the diencephalon. But if I ask you, I would ask you, give me the term that refers to both the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the infundibulum, and the posterior pituitary, and that answer would be the diencephalon. Now, the thalamus, which is the next word, which is part of that diencephalon. The thalamus is an egg-shaped structure. It's above the midbrain, and you can see all that in your notes and in your diagrams. It is above the midbrain. It is hollow. On the inside of the thalamus is fluid, and inside the thalamus is the third ventricle. Lining that inside of the thalamus is a pia mater containing, which is a membrane, the soft mother, containing a cluster of blood vessels known as the choroid plexus. And in those choroid plexus, in that cluster of blood vessels, are the ependymal cells that extract from your plasma the cerebral spinal fluid and release it into the thalamus, and that's where the fluid comes from. Now, in the thalamus, the floor of the thalamus is the hypothalamus, and the ceiling would be the epithalamus. I guess the walls would be just considered the thalamus. Also, hanging from the inside or the back side, sometimes they're in different locations of that thalamus, is the pineal gland, which releases melatonin in response to circadian rhythms, light and dark. But that is your thalamus. The beauty of the thalamus is it is a traffic cop. All the impulses that are coming to your spinal cord and going up that spinal cord through that thalamus, the thalamus sends it to the proper location. For example, I can feel the arms of my chair and where I'm sitting and how my shoes feel on my foot. That's all tactile. It's coming to by sensory afferent neurons in receptors to the spinal cord, traveling up the spinal cord in tracks through the medulla oblongata, then the pons, the midbrain to the thalamus. The thalamus says, this is tactile, sensory. Send it to the post-central gyrus in the parietal lobe. So the thalamus directs everything. Vision, when you see something, it's picked up by the rods and cones in the retina of the back part of the eye. It's sent to the optic nerve. The optic nerve forms a chiasma and then passes the impulse to the thalamus, which directs it where? To the occipital lobe of the brain, so that vision is perceived. That's what it does. Everything except smell, which is olfaction. But everything you see, hear, taste, and touch, except smell, see, hear, taste, and touch, has to go through that thalamus and get directed to the proper location. In the precentral gyrus, right in front of the central sulcus, remember that tissue in the precentral gyrus is motor, and you make a decision for fine and gross motor movements. It is sent to the basal nuclei and then to the thalamus. The thalamus then will send it down the brain stem and out to the motor neurons, motor nerves, to the muscles, so that you can move your body in space at that time. So that's what the thalamus does. The only thing it is not sensitive to is your sense of smell. Olfaction is picked up in the nasal mucosa and by an olfactory bulb. That olfaction is sent by, it is a nerve at that point. Once it goes into the brain, it becomes a tract and it goes deep into the temporal lobes, giving you your sense of smell. It bypasses, it does not go through that thalamus. So keep that in mind. Okay. Cerebral landmarks. Okay, I'm going to mention, there was just 4 biggies. One was the central sulcus, and you can, at this point, you can stop your computer, put it on pause, and look in your textbook at a lateral view of the brain, and you can see the major landmarks of the brain that we discussed. The central sulcus is one that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and it also is the location which points out to the precentral gyrus, which comes before that central sulcus, which is in the frontal lobe and in charge of gross and fine motor movements. The tissue postcentral gyrus, after the central sulcus, that's primarily an area for tactile senses. That's the central sulcus. If you take the brain, which is divided into 2 hemispheres, There's a very deep, deep fissure that separates the two hemispheres. And when you cut the brain, you have to cut through that corpus callosum in those two hemispheres. That is the longitudinal fissure. You also have another lateral fissure, which separates the temporal lobe on either side from the frontal and the parietal. That is a lateral fissure. And then you have another deep, deep fissure that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So that is a transverse fissure. So we had the longitudinal fissure, two hemispheres, transverse fissure separating the cerebral cortex from the cerebellum, and the central sulcus separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So those are the major brain landmarks when I ask for that. The corpus callosum. Corpus means body, callosum, colossal body. And in a mid-sagittal section, I'm not going to, you can stop that and look at a mid-sagittal section through the brain and recall that the corpus callosum is a C-shaped structure that when you dissect the brain, you pull the brain apart by its longitudinal fissure, and you have to take the scalpel and actually cut through that corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a heavily myelinated C-shaped structure which holds the two hemispheres together and enables the right brain to talk to the left brain. That is the corpus callosum. It's a very important and very distinctive structure that you can see in the mid-sagittal section through the brain. That is the corpus callosum. We talked about the precentral gyrus, and we talked about the postcentral gyrus already. So be sure and look at those on your diagram so that you, in your textbook, so you can see the precentral. Remember, precentral gyrus is in the frontal lobe. It's in charge of gross and fine motor movements. So my decision to hold my pencil and underline that precentral gyrus comes from that area. And the postcentral gyrus is that gyri or gyrus, which is just behind the central sulcus, that's involved with tactile feeling, how your body, your clothes, everything that you touch, how it feels is registered in the postcentral gyrus. And that gives us almost 32 minutes for today. That's enough for you today. We've gone through quite a few terms. So now don't wait till the last minute. Don't wait till Thursday night. I do want to tell you what I'm probably going to do. And I figured this out, is your test is at 9:30 Thursday, probably around 8:30 or 8:15. I'm going to do the video on YouTube. You won't receive it until it's over, until I end stream. And when I end stream, that'll be 9:15 or 9:30. And I will, I'll tell you what that will be. And then you can log on to that when I end stream and take your exam. And then once that is finished, 9:30, I'll give you 50 minutes or so. You send that in to me at my email, susancangel@comcast.net. That's how I'm going to do that. Okay. Sure do miss you guys. All right. All right. If you have any questions, let me know. I love the feedback. I'm thankful for it. So thank you for keeping up, and work hard, study hard, stay safe. Okay. Bye-bye.